Hello, my name's Anne-Marie Howell, and I am the author of Mystery of the Night Watchers. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my inspiration for the story and using my hometown as the setting. Now, I live in a small town called Bury-St-Edmunds in the county of Suffolk, which is sandwiched between Norfolk and Essex on the eastern side of the country. And it's quite a small town, but it's very, very historic. It's got a beautiful cathedral, it's got some beautiful gardens and a ruined abbey and lots of really old buildings, really old, interesting buildings, some of which are listed because they're so important. And my town is so full of history. I find it really, really inspiring. So you might be able to see a slide now, and there's a picture there of Mary Tudor, and she was Henry VIII's sister. And amazingly, she is buried in the very church I got married in. She died in 1533. And I feel like I'm just surrounded by all of this history all the time. And I've always wanted to write a book set in my hometown, but didn't really know what idea to use or what to write about. But that idea came when I read an article about Halley's Comet. And in 1910, the Earth passed through the tail of Halley's Comet, which orbits the Earth every 75 to 76 years. It passes the Earth by. And I was really inspired by this because of some very, very interesting things I learned about Halley's Comet. So a lot of scientists at the time had discovered that there was a gas in the comet's tail, and that this gas, they thought, could poison people on Earth. You've got to remember in 1910, scientists still didn't know very, very much. They were just learning how to look at objects in the night sky and work out what they were actually made of. So the discovery of the gas was fairly recent. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the idea for setting the story around a major event like Halley's Comet really stuck with me. And I thought then, okay, I've got that idea. So how do I map that out and set it in my hometown? And I thought, if I've got people watching a comet, perhaps I need a suitable building for them to watch the comet from. And that's when I had the idea of setting it in this beautiful building called Cupola House. And you'll be able to see on the photograph there how Cupola House looked at the time of my story in the black and white photograph, and also today. And it's called Cupola House because of the small structure on its roof, which is a type of observatory. It's called a cupola, and it's right on the top. And it's incredible. It was built in the 17th century, this house, for a prosperous apothecary. I have trouble saying that word sometimes, apothecary. And an apothecary is a type of chemist who sold medicines and cures for all sorts of illnesses and ailments. And that also inspired me to set the story in an apothecary shop, which is what Nancy's grandfather does in the story. So the house has a cupola, and I thought, how can I get up there and have a look? Because it just looked fantastic. But today the building is occupied by a restaurant. So I approached the restaurant and said, is it possible to have a look? And they said yes. So I managed to get a look up inside the cupola. And you'll see on the photograph now what I saw when I went up to the top of the cupola. There were some very, very twisty stairs. And from the top, I got an amazing view across the town. And it had some windows that looked out across the rooftops. I could see to the countryside. I could see into other people's houses. And it really inspired me to write the story. And I began to imagine there was a family in my story who were watching the comet. But what if they were looking through a telescope at the sky, pretending to watch the comet, but in fact looking at something else altogether? Because I really wanted to make the story a mystery. So after visiting Cupola House, I really felt I had the backdrop of Halley's Comet. I found I had a setting for my story in Cupola House and this really interesting event in history to write about. I spent a lot of time wandering around Bury-St-Edmunds and thinking about where my characters went on their journey to solve the mystery of the Night Watchers. And on one of those walks, I went past a beautiful building called the Subscription Rooms, or the Athenaeum, also in Bury-St-Edmunds. And you'll see that on the slide now. And on the left, the photograph is the Athenaeum as it was in about 1910 when the story is set. And the photograph on the right is the building today. And in fact, I took that during the first national lockdown last April, and there were no cars on the roads at all. And it really made me imagine what it must have been like to be back in that time when there were no cars and fewer people walking the streets. And it really helped me to imagine the story. And these subscription rooms were built in the 1850s for social occasions and meetings. And one really interesting fact is that Charles Dickens gave a 6-chapter reading of his book, David Copperfield, there in 1861. And another really interesting fact is the green dome on the roof of the building. Can you see the green dome like a little hat just in front of the flagpole? Now that is actually a Victorian observatory. And the next slide shows what it's like inside the observatory. And it's very old and very closed up at the moment because it's a little bit unsafe for the public. But I did manage to get a tour, and somebody took me up there, and it, just as I describe it in the latter stages of the book, really, I had to go through a very almost secret door, up some rickety wooden stairs, through the inside of the roof space where there was a dead pigeon and lots of cobwebs and spiders, through a trap door, and then into this amazing observatory where the original telescope is still there. And it's a bit like being inside a wooden barrel. It smells warm and musty, and it's built of wood, and the roof folds back and turns around in a complete circle, 360 degrees, to allow the telescope to point to any object in the night sky that it wants to. And it's really like a little time capsule up there. There were lots of old things stuck to the wall. There was a chest of drawers, which I had a sneaky look inside, full of really old letters and notes about astronomical observations. And it just felt untouched, really. And it was quite eerie in a way. And I knew I had to get that into the story. So the observatory does feature in Mystery of the Night Watchers as well. So I absolutely love maps and use maps all the time when I'm writing my historical stories. And you'll see on the screen now the map in Mystery of the Night Watchers. And this is at the front of the book. And I think maps are a brilliant way of helping you to visualize the events that happen in the story. And I used the map to identify the key places that Nancy and Birch went to solve Mystery of the Night Watchers. And I use it to keep track of where my characters are going and what they do at each point in the story to stop myself getting into a muddle. So that's another writing tip, really. Whatever type of story you're writing, whether it's imaginary, fantasy, contemporary, or science fiction, try creating a map of your world and work out where your characters go within it, because it can really help you write the story and make it consistent. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier on about having the idea to write about Halley's Comet, which passed by the Earth in 1910. And a comet is made of dust and ice. And when it nears the sun, it warms up and the ice turns from a solid into a gas, which produces the bright tail of the comet that we see in the sky. And they travel around the sun in an orbit. And Halley's Comet, which features in the story, passes by the Earth every 75 to 76 years. Now, you'll see on the photograph here a picture of Edmund Halley, who discovered the comet in the 1600s, and he worked out that it had an orbit and would return very regularly. Now, Edmund Halley was a very clever man. He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a geophysicist, a meteorologist, a physicist, and he was also friends with Isaac Newton, which was absolutely incredible, and eventually appointed royal astronomer at the Greenwich Observatory. So he was just a really, really clever, interesting guy. But some people in 1910 were very, very afraid of Halley's Comet. And you'll see on the slide here the earliest photograph ever taken of Halley's Comet, which was in 1910. I think it's absolutely incredible. So today, advances in science mean that we know a lot about comets and the night sky. But back in 1910, very little was known about them. And some scientists had very conflicting views about the comet, which made people very, very afraid. And the reason for that, and you'll see these newspaper reports in the slide now, some people in the scientific community thought that the gas in the comet's tail could poison the very air that we breathe. And these fears made it into newspaper headlines all the way across the world. And I read many of these old newspaper articles and learned that this hysteria was very real, and people gave tips on how to survive, one of which even included hiring a submarine to escape the comet. So all of this really captured my imagination, and decided I really had to write about these fears in the story. So I really wanted to get these conflicting views of fear and enjoyment of the comet across in the story. And Nancy, at the beginning of the book in particular, feels a little bit scared because her mother is behaving a little bit strangely, and she wonders whether it's because she's afraid of the comet. And I'll read you a passage now from page 15 of Mystery of the Night Watchers, where Nancy talks a little bit about her fears and why she's worried about the approach of Halley's comet. Every evening for the past month, Nancy had been scouring her father's copy of the Leeds Mercury newspaper for articles about Halley's comet, which was due to pass by the Earth after an absence of 76 years. Advances in science meant that this time the presence of a toxic gas in the comet's tail had been detected. Her father had explained that this in itself was not thought to be a problem, but as the Earth was due to travel directly through the comet's tail in less than a week's time, there had been some talk that the gas would be deadly to humankind. The closer the comet got to Earth, the clearer it became, and for the past week, Nancy had watched for it from her bedroom window, wondering if she should be worried about it. For some scientists were telling people to stay indoors, seal up their windows, wear a protective gas mask, and take preventative anti-comet pills to stop themselves from being poisoned. Nancy's father was firmly of the opinion that the comet would cause no ill effects and anticipated its arrival keenly. But Nancy's mother's cheeks would become drawn and pale when anyone spoke of the comet. This caused a glimmer of unease to rise in Nancy's chest, and she wondered whether her mother perhaps had a different view that she was keeping to herself. Could that be why she had been standing in the garden, looking at the night sky a little fearfully? So that's a reading from Mystery of the Night Watchers that talks a little bit about Halley's comet and the fears that people had of it, and Nancy had of it as well. But people did overcome their fears, and they did this by using a variety of measures that I also write about in the story. So you'll see on this slide here a picture of Hope's anti-comet pills. And this was a thing that was actually sold more in the USA than here, but I do refer to it in England. And they were just made out of sugar paste, but people saw a way of making quick money, and they were basically using people's fears to make money by saying, here you go, here's an anti-comet pill that will stop you getting poisoned from the gas. And it was just completely false. But people bought them, and they also went to church to pray. They wore gas masks, and people also sealed up their windows with putty in the hope that the gas wouldn't creep through the cracks. And I refer to all of those things in the story. But thankfully, there was nothing to fear at all, and the comet blazed past the Earth with no incident. And as we know now, there was no chance at all of the gas poisoning people due to the advances in science that had been made. But many people in 1910 did choose to celebrate the comet. And this slide here shows a couple of things that I found out when I was doing my research in newspapers. And I found out a lot of people sold opera and field glasses, telescopes, and also lots and lots of people celebrated by having parties to celebrate the comet's arrival. And there were parties on New York rooftops, on riverboats, on the River Seine, and all of those things really captured my imagination and gave me the idea for the mayor in my story to hold an amazing comet party. And that comet party builds up throughout the story in Mystery of the Night Watchers. So Halley's comet will next be visible in 2061. So get your cameras and telescopes ready, because I think it's going to be a real spectacle and really interesting to watch, although I'm sure the newspaper headlines won't be quite so sensationalist when this comet makes an appearance next. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to my short talk about my inspiration for Mystery of the Night Watchers.